Hey everybody, but not able to stream, but I am. So once again, I'm back again this week to read some scripture and to talk about it a little bit. Um, Now, a little change is I've moved away from the pandemic faith devotional because it was finished this past week. So now I've decided to use the text I'm going to reflect on every week. Um, I'm going to use the Revised Common Lectionary, and I'm just going to use the daily readings for the day for Wednesday. Um, Now, the Revised Common Lectionary is something that I use and have used since I graduated seminary to guide my preaching each and every weekend. And sometimes I'll use it some of the midweek stuff during Lent and Advent if I haven't come up with another program. And sometimes it's just called the lectionary because although it's called the Revised Common Lectionary, that assumes that there was something that was done before it. But quite honestly, this has always been available since I became Lutheran. so, so I usually just call it the lectionary. Thing about using this is that, especially the midweek readings, is sometimes you get to hear some of the really obscure and odd stories that are in the Bible. Although that's not the case this week, I am hoping that it comes up in the future as I scour through the different readings each week. But this week we do have a familiar, but what I believe is also an important text, and that it comes to us from the Gospel of John, the 13th chapter, verses 1 to 17. And this is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put in the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. During supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. And then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter and said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you will share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." As he washed their feet, after he washed their feet, he put on the robe. "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." And here ends the reading of. Now, it never fails whenever somebody hears this text, they will ask me the question, "So what is this pastor about?" Always thinking there might be, something else going on. But if you ask me, this episode is simply a story about humility. And that reading anything else into it requires an awful lot of speculation. But as fans of American football know, that when a call is challenged on the field, the umpire says, "Upon further review," and then gives a decision. So maybe that's what I'm going to do here is take a few minutes to look a little closer at this story from John about Jesus and his disciples. See, the event in question comes right before the Last Supper. Although John doesn't actually have a story about the Last Supper because three other disciples had already written about it by the time John's gospel came along. Instead, he records this specific story in specific reference to Jesus and his band of disciples, who are prone to just spend just exactly who is the greatest of them all. And this in dramatic fashion, because Jesus loved them so much, he taught them this lesson in humility. See, the details of foot washing is really an act of hospitality. And it was well known in Jesus' time throughout all the cities, a religious ceremony. But this was simply a tradition of good manners on the side of the host or hostess when they were having guests in him or her home. And everybody were her home. Everybody went places. These were dusty roads, or when it rained, it was muddy, and all people had were sandals on their feet. So usually by the time they got to their destination, their feet were pretty dirty and dingy. And so it was very common when somebody would walk through the door into somebody's home, right there next to the door would be a basin of water and a towel or an apron for people to wash their feet. And again, this is important to note about foot washing because this was something that was usually done for a guest. It was a very menial task that was usually done by servants if they were available. As some scholars have said, it was a degrading and lowly task. It was not on everybody's wish list to say, "Oh, let me go wash a bunch of people's feet." And again, the specific social implications were nobody that was perceived as higher in status than somebody else would even consider washing somebody else's feet, let alone somebody of their same status. So there can be no question of what Jesus was doing to set up this example of humility and humble service to the often too proud disciples. And yet this was a way of once again Jesus showing us before his death of God's perfect love and service to one another. And so when we consider trying to be a part of that God's, perfect love, we don't have an excuse to nurse grudges or to wallow in unloving behavior. As we are washed by Jesus and God's deep and generous love, our hearts are stretched to love our community more fully, more unwavering. Because see, in the story of this foot washing that we heard, then we have the most profound revelation of the heart of God in Jesus Christ apart from the crucifixion itself. We also learn more about the relationship between Jesus and his disciples, as well as Jesus's disciples among one another. The community that Jesus has been forming throughout these 3 years he's been with them is finally starting to have a definite shape, and it reveals even more clearly that it is humble and self-sacrificing to one another. See, some of the commentaries that I've read about this passage I personally believe might be reading a little too much into it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I am a fan anytime that we can tie the sacraments into this. I just don't see a reference for baptism here or for sacramental theology, as we call it in general, except that this event occurs right before the Last Supper. But the foot washing event, in my eyes, stands on its own. I do agree that Jesus is making a spiritual connection to the concept of foot washing when he tells Peter, "You," which is plural, by the way, not singular for just Peter, but "you all here are, but not all of you." Again, making the exception for Judas. However, in my judgment, as I still read all these things and I read this text, I believe Jesus's main point about the spiritual foot washing applies to the apostles as such, rather than the church that is to come in the future. I believe that Jesus is talking about his relationship with his disciples at that very moment. He says, "You all are clean. You are my true disciples. I've spent more than 3 years bathing you in truth and grace, and you are now ready for your mission." Now, this does not mean that you're perfect, of course. What I am doing for you right now is physically washing your feet is the equivalent of spiritually dirt of pride that still infects people's souls. And this is the application that Jesus himself, I believe, makes to all the disciples. See, there may be some type of analogy between Jesus is humbling himself to wash the disciples' feet and the supreme humbling he exhibits by dying on the cross. And in that analogy, the cross is the main point of comparison, is the attitude that is manifested by Jesus in each of the cases, his attitude of submission. The foot washing can be seen and is often called a parable in action. Another analogy, namely, between the way the foot washing cleanses one's feet from physical dirt and the way the cross cleanses our soul from sin. But even in the midst of some of these loose analogies, I personally, though, am good with where I started. And I think that this is simply a much needed and powerful illustration in humanity and humility. That we could all use a lesson of humility every now and then, couldn't we? Well, that's what I got for this week, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, hope to see you next week, and take care of yourselves and each other.